Well, I'm open the Monday, July 15th, 2013 regular meeting of the Eugene Planning Commission. As is our custom, we reserve a few minutes at the beginning of our meeting for public comment. It can be a comment on any matter except items scheduled for public hearing or public hearing items for which the record has already closed. Generally, we limit you to 3 minutes. And if you want to speak, as I mentioned before the meeting, fill out a green slip. I have one today, and that's David Berg. And if you'd come up maybe to this chair, sure. Okay. Speak into the microphone, list your name and address, and we have two. John decided to speak. I'll just say John, and I won't try and pronounce your last name.
I'm David Berg, 4125 Brayburn Drive. And I wish to speak about the redesignation of the Rest Haven property. My main concern, and that of my neighbors, is the drainage and erosion and wind throw risks of developing the western slope of Rest Haven. I have a topo map which reflects that, and each of you have received a copy of the topo map. Right now, the conditional use permit for the cemetery has a 75-foot boundary, a 75-foot buffer between the cemetery and the neighboring properties. And that 75 feet is arbitrary. The actual depth of the slope from the creek that runs behind our homes on Brayburn to the top of the slope varies anywhere from 75 feet to 3 or 4 times that. And that can be seen on the map, with seeing where the forested area is. I'm not sure that the forested area actually follows the top of the ridge line. There's probably a little bit extra space that's still forested, especially in the southwest area, southwest portion of that. But in the redesignation of the Rest Haven property, I respectfully request that the geography be used to determine the buffer rather than an arbitrary length, an arbitrary distance of 75 feet, so that the neighbors are protected from the risks of drainage, erosion, and wind throw. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Berg. Next, I have John.
Sorry.
Okay.
I'm John Sealer, SIHLER, 4235 Brayburn Drive. About 4 or 5 lots.
If you'd speak into the microphone, one or the other would be great.
About 4 or 5 lots this way from David, who just spoke, and it's where we live, where that path cuts across. I agree with David. I've seen his diagram, in which he, in effect, says that the development should be limited to where his red line is, and we would agree. In addition to the reasons he gave, personally, we look up at that slope. I mean, we face it, and the prospect of having that slope be homes or housing of any type is really offensive to us. I mean, and that's an additional, from our standpoint, that's an additional ground for limiting the expansion of the cemetery to the top of that ridge. That's, well, it seems as if the neighbors have been in a duel with the cemetery for going on 15 years. And, I mean, well, and here we are again. Sorry.
Thank you. Any comments from commissioners or questions at this point?
If I may just say so, when we moved in, the people on Brayburn, we got very explicit promises from the cemetery people, including originally the current owner, why we're never going to come near your property. And
Okay. Thank you.
Got it. Thanks.
Well, our next agenda item is, oh, I'm sorry, John.
We're going to discuss this individual property later today? Okay.
Yeah. It is on our list to discuss today, so,
I'll hold my questions till then.
okay. All right, thank you. Next item is Envision Eugene Housing Redesignations Continued. We've got Heather and Terry.
Great, thank you. So last Monday, we opened the discussion about the sites that we're looking at or exploring for redesignation to a type of designation that would allow either a different type of housing or allow housing in general. So just, I know Commissioner Belcher wasn't here last week, so this is our potential study areas map. The first three bullets, Crow Road here in West Eugene, Ayers and Gillum in North Eugene, and the Naval Reserve property in the middle of town were all part of the draft recommendation. We have two other sites that we were exploring kind of based on new information since the recommendation of last year. The Irving Road Eagles site out on Irving Road and Northwest Expressway, and the Willamette Street Rest Haven property out on, or part of the property out on Willamette Street. And last time what we got through were Crow Road was the first one we talked about. Essentially, one of the things that I brought up was that some of the property owners out on the eastern part were interested in maybe some medium-density residential or neighborhood commercial in this area. So we were recommending having further discussions with the property owners in this area about having their properties not entirely be low-density residential. And we got good feedback from Planning Commission about that, about thinking about medium-density residential along West 11th being potentially a good idea, but coordinating with ODOT, making sure that that would make sense for them as far as the traffic constraints out here. There was some discussion about considering height limits, and even maybe limiting the type of commercial that would happen out here based on the proximity to residential, based on this area of town being kind of on the edge of the city, and not wanting to kind of create a strip commercial area in this location or have really tall buildings on the edge of town. So exploring that. The other site that we talked about was the Irving Road Eagles site. So this situation, it's currently zoned R1. It's designated Parks and Open Space. It was recently purchased by the Westside Baptist Church, so no longer in Eagles Lodge site. This situation and Rest Haven, which is what I would suggest we talk about next, are a situation where our metro plan identifies parks and open space throughout the city, and some of them are actually privately owned. And so not just these sites, but potentially in the future, there's kind of a policy question here where you've got privately owned parks and open space designated property, where if those property owners don't want to continue those open space type uses anymore. How do we handle that? What is the appropriate designation for those properties if they don't want to continue that use anymore? And if the city, particularly the Parks Department, is not interested in buying those properties. What we talked about with Irving Road last time is circling back with our Parks Department staff, making sure that there isn't any portion of the property that they want to buy. There were some comments also that given that it's low-density residential around it, that if it were to go to housing, maybe low-density residential would make sense, but that we should kind of double-check with Parks first. Our initial conversations with them is that there was no money for Parks acquisition in this area from the 2006 bond. It wasn't identified as an area that needed additional parks, but I want to let the commission know that we have circled back with Parks. They're willing to do a site visit on the property, so we will be doing that, not this week, but next week. So we're continuing to pursue that avenue to see if there is any portion of it that meets a priority park need.
That's a quick question.
Sure.
When Parks and Open Space did their inventory,
Yeah.
did they include private parcels such as this as part of that inventory?
I think they count, right, they count things like schools. I think that's the only non-city owned property that they count in.
But they only count publicly owned property.
Right. So we're not taking from the inventory if that
Right.
were to
Right.
change. Thank you.
I had a question too. The map that we got this morning
Uh-huh.
has a property on it indicated with a green star and a circle. That's not on the map that was in the original agenda package. And it's actually not terribly far away from it.
Yeah, I don't think the original agenda package had all of the parkland identified on that map. Yeah, so
Different map.
you're talking about this map?
Yeah.
Yeah, this map,
It only shows,
it doesn't really show any parks. Yeah, so it looks very similar. But yeah, the map that we forwarded this morning is
Just Parks and Schools.
right. So it's existing parks and it's areas that Parks, through their long-range planning, has identified a need for additional park acquisition. So that's the difference between those. So I thought we could continue this kind of question, this kind of citywide, and with respect to Willamette Street and Rest Haven, just kind of go into that site specifically, and then talk about Gillum Road and Ayers. Those are our two North Eugene sites, and then the Naval Reserve property, if that works for everyone. I do have also loaded on here the PowerPoint from last week, so if there's any slides that you want to see from last week, let us know and we can go backwards. So I'm going to turn it over to Terry to talk a little bit about Rest Haven.
Okay.
Can I go back just a second?
Sure.
I'm looking at the Parks and Open Space planned facilities map, and it shows an R3, R4, and Irving Road halfway between River Road and Northwest Expressway. Couldn't this possibly fit that R3, R4 designation? But Parks and Recreation is saying they're not interested because they do show a potential future site there.
What map are you looking at?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Parks and Open Space map.
So not the Envision Eugene Parks map,
Right.
but the
The
pros
original
plan
pros
map?
plan
I don't
So
have
if
that
you
in
could
front of
circle
me.
back with them and ask them about R3,
Sure,
R4, that
sure. And so R3, R4.
I think that's a
That's
regional.
the coding.
Oh, okay.
And as I understand it, everything that was on that pros map was moved over to this map, but, so we'll double check on that. and
Okay,
just
thank
make
you.
sure we're not-
Just happened to be studying that area for another reason.
Great, thank
what
you.
ward is that?
Well, it's out, this property is actually,
It's Mike Clark.
yeah, it's Mike Clark's. It is outside of the city limits right now, so it's Mike Clark and Jay Bozovich, I believe, is the Lane County Commissioner.
City limits,
It hasn't been annexed yet. Yep,
inside the UGB.
The particular property.
right.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's actually been,
Properties around
they've submitted an
that.
annexation application already, but it's pending. Okay, so moving on. Oops. So this is the only one in here for Rest Haven, right?
You want the lights down?
It's up to you. Is this a legible air photo, the way it is?
Are you okay?
Okay. So this is Rest Haven Cemetery, or Rest Haven Memorial Park. It's a property located on Willamette Street, and the red dot is at 40th on Willamette. You can see that up in the upper right-hand corner of the slide. About half, roughly half of the cemetery property is developed with burial plots and buildings. And the southern half, as I explained last time, so I won't completely redo the presentation, but just to orient you, the southern half is undeveloped. And there is a cleared area, and then a portion of the property is still treed. There is a drainage that crosses the far southwest corner, and a neighborhood path that is in use, although not owned by the Neighborhood Park Association. So you can see that little drainage that goes across the corner there. Off of the Rest Haven site, it is covered by Edgewood Townhomes Association, I believe. Yeah, so at either end of that triangular piece, there are pieces of property owned actually by the Homeowners Association of Edgewood that cover the path and cover the trail uses that are happening there. But on the Rest Haven site itself, that's still privately owned by the cemetery. There's a church in the southeastern corner that sort of carves out a corner, and the only access to the cemetery is from Willamette Street. There's also a stub street of 40th Avenue. Let's see if I can use the little pointer here. Yeah. This is 40th over here, and there's a skinny little piece of right-of-way, and then it goes this way up to 46? 39th, thank you, 39th. And that's mostly used for access to the cemetery's structures and other uses. So there's a history of past land use approvals and applications on the southern half of the site. What's currently in effect is an approved conditional use permit for the cemetery to expand the cemetery use, and that approved CUP also includes a 75-foot buffer, as referenced by Mr. Berg. It's just one of a bunch of conditions of approval contained in the development agreement. The other interesting thing about this property is there is an on-hold application for housing that is for controlled income and rent housing, which is allowed under the site's current Parks and Open Space designation and R1 zoning. Sorry that's so complicated, but if you have any questions about that, do let me know. It is on hold. It could be reactivated by the applicant at any time. It does propose housing within the buffer area, but that's not approved as of now. It would have to be reactivated, and the city would have to review that application for the buffer to change. Question?
Yeah, how long is something on hold? Is there a limit to the time?
We haven't gotten a legal answer to that question. It has been on hold since 2002, processed, appealed to LUBA, and remanded back to the city. So it's had a long
Okay,
path.
thank you.
And then I guess my question, Terry, is you say that it's on hold and it's been approved, but it also included housing in the buffer zone, which wasn't approved. I'm not sure what has been approved, what hasn't been approved.
Okay.
Can you kind of maybe clarify that a little bit so we know kind of what's in
Sure.
place?
Well, I think the simplest way I could put it is that housing application was approved with a series of conditions, but that was appealed and LUBA remanded it, and so the remand issues have not been addressed.
So
So it's been remanded but not
Right,
addressed.
so it's kind of in limbo.
Okay.
John?
And it hasn't been addressed because the applicant,
Hasn't reactivated it yet,
Okay.
right.
so if the applicant says, I don't want to go any further.
Right, they could abandon that plan, or they could ask the city to begin reviewing it again.
So then the next step, if they wanted to review that plan, would be to address the remand
Right.
issues and then go from there.
Right.
Terry, was the buffer a remand issue?
I do not know if the buffer was a remand issue. I could look into that. Yeah,
That'd be helpful, I think.
sure.
So it would be useful to, I mean, we've changed the code since 2002. I don't know if
Absolutely.
Specifically has changed anything that might be a remand issue here. How can you hold a remand in perpetuity until you're ready to apply in 2055, perhaps?
Right, it's a really good question, and we haven't answered that yet. I do want to be really clear, though, that that's not the question that we're trying to get to here. Development review and standards and what's in effect and the review process is a later step. What we're talking about today is redesignation, and the redesignation does not directly affect either of those, either the on-hold or the approved CUP. They both retain the status that they have. What would change is the designation of the southern portion of the property from Parks and Open Space to low-density residential. And if that happened, the reason we think that might be a good idea is that for the city, we could reduce our need to expand the urban growth boundary by a like number of acres. And on the applicant's side, it would open up the possibility of designing and submitting a different land use application. So it wouldn't require this, but it would allow subdivision R1 type development, because then the R1 zoning would match the designation, but a new development application would have to be submitted. Question?
Yeah, one final one. The application that's on hold, you said it wouldn't affect that on the redesignation. Does that mean that it's not in this southern portion of the property?
No, it just means that they're separate issues. So when we change a designation, we're changing what the future allowed land uses are and what the requirements will be to get that type of development approved. And this is an oddball, so I'll try as best I can to explain this unique situation. But the only type of housing that is allowed with the current designation, Parks and Open Space, is a controlled income and rent housing type. So that's why that was allowed to be submitted. It was reviewed, and what happened happened.
I've got John Borofsky, then John Belcher.
So, as I'm following this, the low-income one, which was on the 2002, that went through. That's on hold. Subsequent to that, conditional use permit was sought.
That's the other way around.
Conditional use permit was sought first.
For the cemetery use, yes.
Granted, correct?
Yes, and approved in the
For cemetery Or
90s.
for housing in there.
For cemetery.
And that's the one that had the buffer. So if we redesignate this, there is no buffer.
Right.
And is that, if that is done, is there a process in the redesignation for the city to require the buffer? Or would that, I mean, it was required in the CUP, because that was part of,
There was a
if you
development.
want to do
right.
this,
Right.
you've got to put this in there. If we redesignate, it seems to me that there will be no way for the city to say you have to have that buffer. Is that correct?
It's the central question, I think, and what we've been struggling with in terms of policy tools. At the time of redesignation, we don't normally do that, carry forward a specific development requirement, either from a past development application or a new one that we think might be good, because we don't have a proposal to review. And I think it's a good point that David brought up. The 75 feet was negotiated at the time of the CUP, but it doesn't follow any sort of topography. Applicant might think it's too big, neighbors might think it's too small, and so at this time, I think that would not be a wise thing to do, because we don't know if that's an adequate width for what might be proposed in the future.
So if we redesignate and the property owner says, I want to put a put housing in there. They come to us, if it's redesignated R1, what are the tools that the city has to protect the surrounding neighborhoods, i.e., what you would use in a conditional use permit?
Right. There are a lot of contingencies, so bear with me. If the applicant came forward with a housing for a subdivision, then we have lots of requirements in there for subdivision development. We have erosion requirements, natural resource requirements, tree removal requirements. The whole code book applies, and so we would review that against all of the standards that are currently in place. The other thing to keep in mind is that, as Heather mentioned with the Irving Road site, we've called Parks about this site and just to see if they're interested in buying any of it or securing an easement or anything, and we're still working with them on that. We hope to also get a site visit with the Parks manager, planning manager on this site as well. So that's one tool. Aside from development review standards, we work with the Parks Department and Public Works Department because we've got a drainage here. There could be an interest in acquiring that drainage for stormwater reasons.
Is that Goal 5 protected?
It is. Yeah.
Another question that I had was the path that goes across the property. Would there be an easement?
Right here.
Yeah.
So that's the drainage. The path kind of comes in on, let's see, this side, right? The other side, okay. North of it. It follows back here in the trees.
Actually, follows the creek right on the creek.
Okay, anyways,
The question
parallels
would
the
be-
creek.
The question was, would there be a,
Excuse me,
No, it's the north side.
would there be, since it's been used for years and years, is that something that is a public easement?
It is not currently. It's just allowed without any sort of enforcement, I guess I would say. I think it's something that we'd like to see if we could get an easement there from the property owner, an easement or a purchase, but we don't have a resolution on that yet.
And then I'll jump in too, since we're discussing this. So you said this is Goal 5 in this, that
Yeah.
drainage way?
This little stream, I'm pointing at it on the screen here, right here, is covered with a 40-foot setback. And there's another second one, a portion of which up here on the site is covered by a 20-foot setback. So those are our currently protected Goal 5 areas on the site.
And so any proposed future subdivision that might be submitted would have to address the Goal 5
Oh, yeah.
resource portion as well as all the other subdivision
Yes,
requirements.
traffic, utilities, everything.
Well, not the
Well-
current controlled income, right?
He said any future subdivision.
okay.
Yeah.
But the controlled income has already been approved as a CUP,
Yeah,
demanded.
remanded, but
Yeah.
it is a significant difference in what the old code required and what the new code requires. So the old controlled income and rent application is vested under the old code. Doesn't have the same teeth in terms of tree preservation and other natural resources related criteria. So that's a significant reason for the applicant to keep that on hold and keep it vested. Yeah, but we can't address that in this.
Yeah, no, and I understand. And,
Yeah.
and I understand this is a work session where you're getting our input.
Exactly.
Again, that this will be coming to public hearing before us. I think, is this the September 10th proposed date? Have I got my dates right?
Yeah, we haven't actually scheduled
we
it
not
yet.
scheduled
That
it yet?
That is your first tentatively scheduled public hearing for Envision Eugene efficiency measures.
Okay.
If the city decides to go forward with putting this on the list, then that would be the opportunity for the public to weigh in a hearing setting, and you'd have recommendation meetings, and the council would also hold a hearing.
Terry.
Do you have a question? Yeah? A comment? Do you want to allow that?
Yes, sure.
It is my recollection that the buffer was a significant remand issue.
Remand issue, okay.
But don't quote me on that. It would
Okay.
actually have to be researched.
I will definitely dig that
You're
up.
on Metro TV.
Yeah.
Forever. Okay, thank you. Jeff?
My question is from this aerial view, I can see where the wooded area is, and I presume the 75-foot buffer is contained within that wooded area, but it's also been mentioned that there's a ridge line or something that is also there. I'm curious where.
Yeah. The email that was sent to you, forwarded to you, included the topo map. It's really the top of a slope, and I'll use my arrow if it'll show up. Roughly along the tree line it's a topo line, and from here it sort of drops off down into a low point, and the stream being the lowest point on the property. So roughly around here, this is the top of the slope.
John?
Well, I haven't seen that map, so some of my questions might be answered by it. But first of all, are we only talking about the wooded area? Is the open area in play as well?
Yes, it's in play. Roughly across from about here. There you go. Bill has the map. Just the extent of the developed cemetery area follows roughly this line. So we're talking about all of this southern, roughly 47 acres. And, arguably this would be the most developable portion of that property.
So should this move forward, and should we want to do something to allay the concerns of the neighbors about some sort of a buffer, couldn't we apply a lot-specific overlay zone to this property?
An overlay zone that would
Define that buffer.
through zoning at the time of redesignation, not typically. I mean, we've thought about this. What do you think,
But
Gerald?
we have all kinds of overlay zones all across the city.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things to think about is this is R1 property already, zoned R1. Properties to the west were developed in the 70s, late 70s? 60s to 70s, dealing with the same topography issues and drainage issues, but with older codes and at a previous time. So that there's been mention of foundation issues and things, and building in the hills, those will become issues. But that being said, in terms of protecting one use from another, we're not looking at a typical compatibility issue here of higher density and lower density, or the commercial facility or something. This would cause the land uses to match. So one way of looking at it is we use the tools we have in the development code and the acquisition tools if we're able to work with parks to address those issues.
But the neighbors do have a conditional use permit that sets aside a 75-foot boundary. I would be very interested in seeing, if this is redesignated, that an equivalent boundary exists, whether that be the ridge line or 75-foot. Because that's what's not in the code, but what's in the legal agreements now. In order for this to become R1 rather than cemetery, I would be more comfortable if I knew that there was a way that the neighbors could be assured that the legal agreement they had before would follow forward, even if the use changed.
Other commissioners' comments on that?
I think I would tend to agree with that from the standpoint that if I purchased in that neighborhood at that point, that would be something that I would have expected and may have affected my decision in a purchase. May not, but I think that's certainly a valid point, that's something, it's a legal document that's already in place. And I think I have some concerns about the possibility of that just going away, which I'm not hearing a lot of assurances that it might not. And so I think I would share some of John's concerns. And then, John, you had a comment.
I have one more question, if I may.
Okay.
And that is access. Can you identify an access that would allow for that development to occur?
What was proposed previously was, where's my arrow? There it is. An access on Willamette Street coming in to serve the development and going back out to Willamette Street. Secondary emergency access would then have this 40th Street right-of-way. But that being a local street and Willamette being an arterial, it makes a lot of sense to direct all the new traffic to Willamette. But again, we don't have a traffic study. We don't know exactly what would be required. There have been a couple of neighborhood comments from neighbors not adjacent to the buffer part of the property, but over here on Willamette or on 39th, and those have mostly been about access and transportation, and just wanting to know what would be the process of reviewing that in the future. And we would require a traffic study for development of this size, and they would have to identify either existing good capacity or mitigation measures like a signal at 40th or something like that to handle the additional traffic.
So conceivably, their access could be through a signalized intersection.
It could be, yeah. Oops.
Yeah, I was a little confused. I believe, Terry, I heard you say something about it's already currently R1.
It is, yeah, zoning.
If it's currently R1, then why are we redesignating low-density residential, which is also R1? I mean, I don't understand.
It would be to have the zoning and the plan designation match. Right now, because of the cemetery use, and we can't really find out how history was written, but at a point in time,
Parks and open space.
yes, some cemeteries in the city were designated parks and open space on the Metro Plan map. A lot of them aren't. A lot of them are designated low density already and zoned R1, but this one and a couple other properties have the parks and open space designation.
In addition to R1.
Right, so they're at two different levels. We've got the Metro Plan level and the zoning level.
Which one is the Metro?
Parks and open space.
Okay. Second question, which Commissioner Belcher raised, not over a PUD overlay. When you redesignate something, rather than taking the whole southerly portion, couldn't you just take that portion that's flat up by the ridge line?
Mm-hmm.
As an example.
Right. We've thought about that. One of the things we have to figure out is, as we prepare this whole package of amendments for city review and then eventual approval by the state, we have to document our reasons for doing what we're doing. And typically at a designation level, you wouldn't do that. That's not to say you can't do it, but we're not sure we can. So it's another question for us to figure out.
You can't do a partial lot? Is that what you're saying?
No, you could do a partial lot, but you need to establish an ongoing need, and it would have to be a public need to continue that parks and open space designation. I personally don't feel that would be justified on private property to continue that. It doesn't really make sense to me that we would continue that on a portion of the private property in advance of figuring all of those things out in a development review process. That's how my brain gets there.
And finally, I read somewhere there was a discussion on that southern portion land concerning slope. Now, is that property of a slope of such that you couldn't build there anyway because it's greater than so many?
I think there are areas that the developer, any future developer, would wisely choose to avoid. But I don't think there are areas over 30% slope, which we would not allow by code. Is that right, Heather?
Well, I mean, I think with the controlled income and rent housing application that's in, that being vested, that's subject to the code standards that were in effect at that time. And so I don't think that they have that limitation. So keeping in mind that regardless of what we do with the parks and open space and the low-density residential, even if we kept a small parks and open space area, the controlled income and rent housing applications could still go forward.
Okay, and just a comment, because that second time it's been brought up, we're always faced at this level with a lot of things that we have a 120-day deadline, we have this, we have that. I really think legal should take a look at this and say how something could be on hold, forever. It makes absolutely no sense at all, and then to say that it's, for lack of a better, vested so that none of the new standards apply, which could be totally against everything the city wants to do.
John?
Okay, I have a question and then I have kind of a comment. Question being is if we decide to change it from parks and open space, is that a decision that the property owner has to buy into? Do they have to say, yes, I want this redesignated?
No, but when we set out to do Envision Eugene, we our intention was to work with willing property owners, and so that's what we've done on Crow Road and with the other sites is said, property owner, are you agreeable? And in this case, the property owner has said, I'm agreeable for it to be studied, but I will add to that they're not agreeable to keeping a buffer through the designation as a tool. They don't see this as the right time to do that and resolve that issue. So if we were to try to work with what John Belcher suggested, I think at that point we have to ask, do we still have a willing property owner for this or not?
So if we don't have a willing property owner, then we can't redesignate.
Then we wouldn't, and then nothing would change.
Okay. So
Yeah.
that was my question.
Okay.
My comment would be, the way that I feel about this, would be, I would like to see it redesignated to take the burden off the expansion of the UGB and working towards that goal. That being said, I would hope that there would be, that we'd be able to negotiate with the property owner and make something that works for everybody. That's what I would like to see. I would rather not have it be contentious. I would rather say, okay, I can live with this. I can develop this property in this way. The Brayburn people will still have, hopefully, as much as what they want as they can get, and the property owner will have a developable piece of property that will make sense both economically and aesthetically, and we can lower our use, or we can increase the number of houses inside the UGB. That would be the win-win scenario that I would like to see going forward. So that's.
Thank you.
I have myself in the queue, and then Jeff. Getting back to the question, Terry, about a partial designation for parks and open space, was I hearing you basically saying that if we did a partial redesignation to low-density residential, but reserved, let's say, part of that for parks and open space, that given that scenario, it would really involve only doing that if the city was willing to step up and buy it for parks, or to be on that list? Is that kind of what I was hearing?
Yeah, that was my inclination, or my win-win would be checking in with parks, seeing if that's a possibility. Otherwise, I don't think it's advisable to keep an area designated parks and open space against the property owner's will, and while still in private ownership.
And you said you're trying to get up there with parks and open space also.
Yeah.
Jeff?
I guess my first thing that I'm kind of first conclusion I'm drawing is that I think you don't really have a cooperative property owner here. You've got a conditional property owner here that, we talk about trying to find a way to secure the space, but the property owner has said they're against that. At least that's what I think I've heard. They don't want to have that limitation on development. I guess we could try to buy it, but that's another leap of faith that that's going to be something acceptable to them. If you put this to the faith of the code, then you're going to probably be in a PUD, I think, and you're going to be subject to the open space requirements that must be met in that PUD. And there's no guarantee that that buffer would be part of that. I don't think how we can sit here and say that. But I keep going back to the fact that I'm not here. We've got a cooperative property owner here. I think they're trying to play it both ways. That's where I'm at.
John?
And just one thing, getting back to the acquisition, if it were to be acquired by parks, I think that if it wasn't already identified, trying to get parks in that neighborhood or that area, that area is well served by parks and open spaces, actually overly served by parks and open spaces, and to try and get some of that money out of anywhere for more parks in that part of town might be might be an uphill battle at the least.
I think you're right in that, when you look at the types of parks that are in that area, we have a lot of natural open space types of parks. Ironically, actually, I think there is a deficit of neighborhood parks in the area that, like, with a playground that would serve small children, and that's why we want parks to look at this and say, would this be suitable for the type of need that you have? It may or may not be.
But that being said, I don't think that's what the neighbors are looking for. If it were,
Right.
they're looking for it to be the character of the ridgeline trails. That type of thing is what I've heard. So.
Well, back to Terry.
I don't think I have anything else to say. I mean, I appreciate your feedback, and I think it illustrates the challenge with this piece of property. It's not an easy one because there are so many potential scenarios and different ways that things could go. So it's difficult to solve it at this level. What I can say is that we're committed to continuing this conversation with the property owner, with the neighbors, with the City Parks Department, and we'll update you if anything comes out of that. But at this point, I sort of feel like those are some next steps that we have additional work to do to see if this can continue to move forward or not.
Thank you. So,
Since there is the low-income designation on there, was that able to be counted into the inventory?
No, it's done at the designation level, unfortunately. So even though we are pretty sure housing will get developed on this site one way or another, we cannot count that acreage in our land inventory unless we redesignate it.
John.
Just to reiterate, should this come to a hearing or redesignation, I think one of the questions that will be asked is, how does a property stay in limbo forever?
Definitely. That's I have a note to ask legal about that. Yes.
Well, and I think too, the purpose of this as a work session is to get our input, and I think you've heard what some of our concerns are, and certainly what some of the neighbors' concerns are, and I just
Great.
mention that as we move forward.
That's useful.
Yeah.
Things get hard when you've got a constrained UGB, and all that's left is hilly and wet things inside that are adjacent to existing development. So.
True. John.
I'll make a correction from the previous one. That R3, R4 was a neighborhood park, and it's within half a mile of that site.
Okay. So we'll move on to, is Gillum the next one?
Yeah. So, this property is on Gillum Road out in North Eugene. So, we've got Ayers Road here in Gillum. And like we were talking about earlier, also an interesting site as far as the difference between the Metro Plan designation versus the current zoning. So the property's outlined in red. It's almost 10 acres. It is, the Metro Plan identifies it as medium-density residential. The current zoning is R2 mostly, which matches the medium-density residential designation. And then, sorry, I lost my arrow. This corner here of the property is, that's kind of a dark brownish orange, is C1 zoning. So as a reminder, C1 zoning can happen in any residential plan designation. So it doesn't have to have the commercial designation, which you can see it doesn't, to have that C1 zoning.
C1 is like the
Neighborhood commercial, sorry, yeah, thank you. And so when we included this site in the recommendation last year, it was after talking to the property owner. They have a lot of interest in the property being redesignated to low density residential. We had talked at the time about the site being mostly low density residential with maybe a couple acres of it remaining medium density residential. A couple reasons behind that initial thought was, for one thing, this property to the south that it fronts on Ayers Road is actually designated commercial. similar to the subject property, if it were rezoned, it would have to be C1 according to the Willackenzie area plan. So the idea when the Willackenzie area plan was done, this whole area was undeveloped. And so there was this idea that there would be a commercial hub here, neighborhood commercial, with medium density around it somewhere, and then low density around it. So you have that kind of transition of intensity from the street going back into the neighborhood. So that was our original discussion. We went out, did a site visit, looked at how the area has developed. This is also medium-density residential. You can see that how that medium-density residential was used. It was actually subdivided into small lots instead of being, more concentrated, for instance, apartments or something like that. There's also this property has a very high wall along Ayers Road. So not necessarily, it seems like there could be some challenges there with how connected the commercial in this area would be to the neighborhood. That being said, there is also a school right down here. These properties haven't developed yet. And so we talked to this property owner and internally about the idea of maybe having, not requiring commercial on this site like is shown here in the zoning, and maybe making an allowance for the commercial to move over onto the corner. So that would involve, some sort of policy in the Willackenzie area plan to enable that to happen, and would mostly only affect this property owner who we haven't talked to. We've sent an inquiry to them, but we haven't heard from them. So regarding our subject property, I think the thing we wanted to highlight and get some feedback on is this idea of, is it really essential to have medium-density residential transition from neighborhood commercial into low-density residential? Or could we look at something that is more just low-density residential on this site, and that would we would also rezone it at the same time to R1, and then that would allow commercial to happen on this property if it makes sense in the future at some point. The property owner really would like to see as much of this property rezoned to R1 and redesignated to low-density residential. So they would be happy with that. And it's not a huge site, it's just under 10 acres. And so, splitting it in half by low-density residential and medium-density residential, how much is that really necessary? So I wanted to show you a couple other things that might help with some of your questions, or might not. So just to give you a bigger picture, here's our site again. This is the Ayers Road site, which we'll talk about later, that is designated. You can kind of see the light or the darker brown. It's designated medium-density residential, medium density. Then the rest of it's low-density residential. And then zoning-wise, pretty similar. This is all the lighter area is low-density residential. What you have here is that this property right on the corner hasn't annexed yet, so they're still showing as ag. But whenever they rezone, they would have to do that C1 and R2. And then we did some draft. Oh, this is the Willackenzie area plan. So you can see that none of this was built out at the time. This is that property on Ayers and Gillum, and then our subject property is right here. So, we've got a blobby plan that's been interpreted, you can see how it's been interpreted so that really what's happened is that most of this is commercially designated. This whole property, our subject property, is medium density residential, but the commercial discussed here was implemented through the C1 zoning on the property. So we did do a couple of possible, to try to kind of vet out a little bit, could we even split the property by low-density residential, medium-density residential, and keep the C1 zoning on there? It's quite a bit for a less than 10-acre site. This was just an illustration of the idea of kind of continuing the low-density residential along the west side of the property. There is a drainage here. It's not Goal 5 protected, but we just tried to show how it could be somewhat of an amenity if a developer chose to develop that way. This shows kind of commercial in this area, again with the thought that maybe that would lead into commercial on this adjacent property to the south. And then you've got medium density in here, and again, to try to provide a transition, we had low density abutting low density here, that goes into the medium density and the commercial. So, it looks like it might fit, but it's a lot of zonings, different zoning designations for one property. So what you might imagine is something that's one option would be medium density down here with the rest of it being low density, or just all of it being low density. So anyway, those were kind of the things we're struggling with on this site. It's currently vacant. The property to the south is not vacant. A big part of it is on the corner, but it actually has a house in this area right here.
Okay. I have John Belcher first, and then myself in the queue.
Yeah, could you stop there?
Yep.
So the area that's purple in the Metro Plan designation has a single element?
Yes.
That makes life more interesting. It doesn't make sense to me to have the commercial off the main road in the current zone. It almost looks as if that purple property was mismapped slightly to the north. But
I think it's because the purple property has not annexed yet, and they haven't rezoned yet. And so if they were to come in for a rezoning, it would look similar to our subject site, where you would have C1 probably on this side and R2 on this side, on the corner of those two streets. Yeah, and I think this is an example of, again, and that's why I wanted to kind of show you the older Willackenzie area plan, where the whole area hadn't developed yet, and so the idea at the time was, we'll try to put the hub over here away from the existing single-family homes, but things have changed. The way it's developed has changed, and I think our understanding of the viability of commercial, really it's good to have two street frontages if possible. That kind of corner market idea I think that's changed a little bit in our knowledge as well.
But nonetheless, we're talking about the property to the north.
We are, but we could amend the Willackenzie area plan to include a policy that would allow, if the southern property owner wanted to put the commercial on the corner instead of how it's shown on the designation, just to make it easier for them.
All that makes sense to me.
And I guess that was kind of my thought, is it seemed to me that commercial at the corner of Ayers and Gillum seemed to make more sense than having it in farther the way it was originally designated. And I know, I don't know what Ayers Road was like when the Willackenzie area plan was done, but I'm sure it has developed more since then. And so I think as things have developed, it does make sense to me also to kind of shift that commercial a little more toward that intersection for just those same reasons of having two street frontages and that. And so I guess that's my comment. John?
Yeah, I have two. Basically, I think it gets very convoluted, and you did an excellent drawing to try to put low-density residential and medium-density residential in there, plus the costs that might be associated in developing all that. Additionally, it gets tricky because you would then be potentially, and I saw you tried to avoid that, putting medium-density residential on the backyards of all of R1. So I sort of support that the whole property go to R1. Another thing that I would say in that is on Gillum, if you look north, when you say there's some empty properties there, I do know that there will be some applications coming in for some more R1 development along there on some of those lots,
Yeah.
3 to 4 acres. So they're building all R1 around there. Okay, my second comment is that you had mentioned that you might want to amend the WAP to Willikenzie Area Plan for a policy concerning the commercial area. My comment would be, if you're going to amend the Willikenzie Area Plan and keeping it brief, just amend it that it's not commercial, make it also R1, since that's what's there. And when they're annexed, they're R1, and the whole thing is R1, and the neighborhood would probably like that.
So just as a clarification, so you would recommend that they don't need to have commercial on this property to the south either?
No, it would make, first of all, from Ayers Road North, there's no sidewalks, there's virtually nothing.
At this point, right.
Yeah, well,
As things develop, it will, at some point, it will infill with the sidewalks.
from what
yeah.
I see, sometimes that's 20 years.
Mhm.
So, after the development. So the point being is that I just think that it shouldn't be commercial at all, and if you tested the neighbors out there, they'd probably come back with that. And I think you already alluded to the fact that when you go across the street, you're looking at a solid wall.
Right.
Which gets into the point, if it's commercial, it's really not a friendly walk, and where are you going to park anyone? The lots are real small. So my comment would be, is if you want to amend anything, just say that when they annex, it'll also be R1 with the other property, of which there's a house and everything there already.
Just to make clear, make sure I'm understanding, that is the southern property, that you've attempted to contact the property owner, but there's been no discussion, so we really don't know
Correct.
where we stand on that piece of property.
Correct.
So I guess I would, with that, I would suggest I'm probably inclined to say the northern property should just be all R1. I don't know if we even have to have the discussion about the southern property at this point in time, because, it's not fun. We're looking for interested property owners. We've got one. It looks like it makes sense to go R1. I'd say take it all on it.
Could I just comment on that? I do want to just be conscious of the fact that we are looking 20 years out. We are doing our kind of one shot at our land use diagram, our new comprehensive plan. So as the area continues to build out, I think we should ask that question. Should there be opportunity for someone to use that commercial designation and apply for the rezone and develop it if they wanted to? Or do we want to preclude that? And like you said, we haven't heard back from that owner, but it's kind of a next step question.
I wouldn't close out any options on that particular piece of property. That could very well be a commercial opportunity.
Yeah, I think the policy we were talking about would just allow it to move to the corner if they wanted to. And I think part of it, too, is that we have a lot of things that we're trying to balance. We're always trying to have a mixture of housing types in neighborhoods so that we have different price points, so that we don't have everyone with the same housing type and the housing costs concentrated in one neighborhood, et cetera, so that we're trying to weigh those things about getting rid of medium density residential here altogether. We're also trying to think about, without doing an analysis of, our 20-minute neighborhoods. I think that's one of the challenges of trying to do a plan where you are trying to think 20 years out, frankly, is that, the Willikenzie plan is an example of that. Their 20-year plan showed commercial in the middle of the block. Things have developed. If there is commercial that would make sense here, it probably makes sense for it to be on the corner. Do we need to require them to do commercial there, or could we just make it easier for them to move it if they want to do commercial? I think it's that not carrot and stick, but regulating it versus making it an opportunity if they want to use it. And I think one of the things we haven't done, with which Mr. Jaworski was kind of mentioning, is circling back with the neighbors in that area and talking about them about future development in that area.
I have myself and then John. And I guess the issue really is, it's currently designated medium-density residential, and are we comfortable redesignating that to low-density residential? And I think I am comfortable with that. I think the C1 aspect of it, I'm not sure I have a problem with C1 being adjacent to low-density residential, since it is neighborhood commercial. I'm thinking, I don't know if Cornucopia at 17th and Lincoln is considered
C1.
Neighborhood commercial, that type of thing. So you can get that kind of neighborhood restaurant or market or those sorts of things that can serve that neighborhood. I think it's maybe unfortunate that there's a big wall along Ayers Road. That's, but it's there, and there's really not much we can do about it at this point. I think, agree with Commissioner Mills as far as the commercial, from the standpoint that it's not technically really in play here because of the property owner, but I think having that option to shift it to the corner, should it stay commercial, I think makes a lot of sense. I guess those are my 25 cents worth. And then we've got John B., then John J.
Well, a
Got John
couple
B.
of things that I would say is, I'm all in favor of C1. I've seen C1 work and work successfully in a lot of areas, and so if the property owner to the south does develop the purple area into C1, then the brown designation on the property does make sense. If they're going to say, no, I don't want to move it to the corner, I want to have the corner stay where it is, and I want to develop commercial where it's at, then keeping that as C1 made, as the WAP envisioned, that might do it with the transition to the others. So I'm not sure quite yet on that. And the only other thing that I wanted to know was, I saw the blob map and the Willamette, the WAP. Is that the blob that was approved under the right? Is it colored the way it's supposed to be colored? Is it on the right? I want to make sure that map is colored the right way. Look at
we'll know
look
soon.
at 19885 and see which color it is. I don't want to go through that again.
Your comment about the C1, I think that is one of the challenges. The good news is that the C1 is zoning, so we could leave the C1 here, which the property owner is not in favor of, but they could add it back at, if they don't develop and say this property decides to develop, they could still do C1. You can do C1 on any
With an LDR.
with a low density residential designation. You
Can you do housing in C1 zoning?
Yes.
discussion a few weeks ago.
Yeah. Right.
So that may be an option. We could check into that.
Yeah.
That's the point I was going to make. I was going to make that the whatever color brown area on the subject property all go to R1, because as you just said, you could do something there. And the reason that I suggested that the bottom go to R1 is they could still do it there anyway, but at least it's consistent, rather than where is the blog and what didn't, and let's move it to there and amend that. If the whole thing is just said to be R1 and they still want to put some C1 activity there, they can still do it.
LDR.
Okay.
Going to show my lack of memory. In order to put a C1 use on an R1 property, what land use application is required?
It's a rezone.
It is a rezone. Okay.
Yep.
So I'd prefer, my preference would be to indicate our desire that C1 be there by indicating it originally, rather than have them say, well, you can always go for a rezone.
Okay. I see what you're saying.
Zoning or plan designation, because if it's, Pardon me?
the opposite.
Is the Congress true, leave it C1, decides he wants to go R1, does he have to rezone for that too?
Well, we're talking
Yes.
zoning and designation. So if it's designated low-density residential, can you do a neighborhood market or a neighborhood restaurant in that designation?
You can, you
Have to do the zoning.
would have to rezone to C1, right. So essentially, our residential designations allow you to rezone. The matching zoning would probably be, R1 or R2 or R3, or you could do C1 neighborhood commercial, provided there's some siting requirements with C1, and size requirements. It's limited in the amount of acres you can do.
I recognize I disagree with
Yeah.
Commissioner Jaworski here, but I'd rather see it designated C1 on the corner.
I'm not talking.
Go ahead.
Well, I don't know who's next.
You're next.
Oh, I'm next.
You're next.
Okay.
I'm trying to keep all the
Inside the
thoughts straight.
designated area, my thing was it should be R1. The owner wants that. The whole thing should be R1. If he wants to change that and he's developed the other sites, I'm sure rezoning that would not be that critical to him. The southern part, which I don't know why it would be brought in, to me, it seems that it could be left the way that it is, although it's not desirable as it is because you want the corner. But it would seem to me that leaves the option for whoever owns that corner, who has been non-responsive, to be able to come back in and get it made C1 if they want, and you have the whole strip there if it's really going to be developed. So sometimes by doing nothing is the best thing, at least as I see it for that southern portion.
Yeah, the only, if I can respond, in this case, it's really interesting because a lot of times our refinement plans don't say where neighborhood commercial should go, and this refinement plan specifically says there shall be neighborhood zoning here, and it shall be in between it and Gillum, there shall be R2. So it's very specific that it's supposed to be on the interior of the block. And all I'm suggesting is that we clarify or amend that statement to say, or it could be on the corner. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be in the middle of the block. In this case, it's odd, like I said, because we have very specific direction in the refinement plan that it not be on the corner. And to amend that to open that possibility, we would have to amend that text, because at the time that they rezone, we would say, no, you can't put it on the corner because the text policy says, the text in the refinement plan says, no, it can't go on the corner.
People listen to the text.
It's very specific.
It's a policy.
And so then, can we?
It's a policy.
Can we do that? I mean, can we go in and change a refinement plan? Because it's going through the whole public process, then it can be a part of that.
Yep, so we would put it as part of the package for redesignating the upper property, and then we would include amending the policy. And it is a policy, it's not just the text, it's actually a policy in the refinement plan, so.
That depends on the willing property owner as well, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. What I'm hearing there then is this would go to a public hearing, and the public would be able to come in and say, do we want to amend that to allow commercial on the corner?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. If they said no, they still weren't given the opportunity to say, we don't want the commercial one lot back either. And I'm saying that if you're going to go to a public hearing on something, you should air both issues that cause the problem and not one that either puts it out that they don't want. That's all I'm trying to say. You see what I'm saying? If they strongly don't want that on the corner, well, we haven't resolved anything. We still have an issue.
Because they're not going to want
If they're listened to, well, put it that way, and it doesn't go on there, then we still have the same problem we started with.
Right.
We didn't give them an opportunity to comment on it.
I have John B., then John B.
And I guess, again, this is just a policy thing. So if we redesignate the property, the Gillum Road property, not the, I'm talking about the other, is that a change to the refinement plan?
Yes.
So that no matter what, if we redesignate this, we are going to be changing the refinement plan?
Yeah. Yep,
So it's just how much do we want to change it?
right.
Well, this is a general statement, but we're talking about making changes in several different parts of town, potentially all at once. I think it's very critical that we make sure that each of the neighborhoods in each of those areas is well aware and has ample opportunity to give their feedback rather than, bang, it all happens at once and people weren't aware. So when I assume there'll be some sort of a public involvement process approval coming forward, then I would be looking forward to having an opportunity to make sure that's sufficient for the changes we're talking about to each of these neighborhoods. That's a generic statement.
Okay.
We've been trying to we have been keeping the neighborhood chairs aware of these projects, and so far have been getting really good help in disseminating what's on the table via email networks and things like that, but
What neighborhood association?
duly noted. Northeast Neighbors.
Any other comments on this at this point? Okay. I think you've heard our input here also.
Great.
Ayers Road?
So, okay, so we got through all those. So the last two are Ayers Road, which is also in North Eugene, and the Naval Reserve site. Ayers Road is here. The Metro Plan and the Refinement Plan both show medium-density residential on this lower portion of the property with low-density residential above. This is the golf course. As I mentioned last Monday, the property owner is actually interested in keeping it as medium-density residential. This is one of the sites, just like the Gillum Road, where we had this on the initial recommendation. So both of these have been out there for public review and have been identified as going to a lower intensity of housing. So while that is the case, I also am cognizant of the fact that the property owner has asked us to not redesignate it. So even though we have, been talking about it going to a lower intensity use, given the property owner's inclination to keep it as medium density residential, I think we would recommend that it not be redesignated anymore.
Comments? Sean?
How many units were proposed for that in low density?
We were,
Well, I mean, if it had gotten redesignated, how many needed use would be?
So it was about 11 acres, and we would have assumed between 40 and 60 homes on it.
So that adds to the need.
Yes.
Although it would have added to the need for low-density residential if we had put it as low-density. There's an overall need, and there's also a need for low-density and medium-density, right?
So what would have happened is, there is, for all of our land use categories, we were short, based on our vacant land. And so, so this would reduce our need for medium density because we'd now count that as medium density residential.
But it would increase our need for low-density.
Correct.
Yeah.
So it
Overall, we
affects
have
our
more
expansion.
Well, given that the property owner is not supportive of this change, I think it makes sense to drop it from the list.
Great. So the last site, I'm just going to go all the way back here, that we talked about was the Naval Reserve site. This is city-owned property. The city intends to work with a affordable housing developer. This is Chambers and 13th, and the site is here. It's now vacant. The buildings that were on it before have been demoed. It's about 3 acres. It's currently designated government and education, and what we are proposing and our community development staff still support is redesignating it to medium-density residential, and at the same time, we would rezone it to R2, which is the matching zoning for that. So we asked ourselves, and we still agree, that it should be redesignated.
So you have a willing property owner?
We do have a willing property owner
So it'll probably go to appeal.
by us.
So that makes sense to me, but I'm wondering, what about the Marine Corps Reserve site as well? Is that eventually going to become available?
I am not aware that it has been put up for sale or surplus at this point yet. Even if it had, it is developed, so it wouldn't it would be, any housing that we might be able to assume on it at a future date would be redevelopment. It wouldn't be, it would count towards that instead of our vacant needs. So it's not as clean of a
Well,
being exercise.
not knowing what might happen with that property, it certainly seems compatible with the surrounding properties, so I would certainly support it.
And I guess that was my thought, too, is with the multifamily across the street, the Unitarian Church on the corner, Faith Center to the east, the school to the south, that there's just a lot of reasons, and 13th is a transit corridor and all of that. It just seems to make a lot of sense to me also. So, John?
Yeah, something along which the chair has stated, when looking at this, the only issue that I would have had, and hopefully it'll be addressed when someone applies to do something there, is the access to that would be more favorable off of 13th than coming in where the school is. If you have a lot of development there, and apparently on, I don't remember how many acres you said that was.
3 acres.
Oh, just 3 acres?
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, so you still could get an awful lot of units there, and if you have the access coming in to where the school frontage is, that might be an issue. That's the only thing I saw, even though it's a step ahead. I just felt that that's going to be critical when that comes in, but I support that redesignation also.
Jeff?
I just want to say I support what the plan is currently for this property.
Great. Thank you.
Other comments?
Great, well, thank you. We made it through all the sites.
With a little bit of time to spare. Okay. So that brings us to other items from staff. Carolyn, anything?
Commissioner Belcher did call me earlier today and request that we send out the information that the other commissioners received at the Benson public hearing. Remember, some folks can turn some stuff in writing at that hearing, and so Zach is out of town, but Gabe is working to collect all that information and make sure that the commissioners who were not at the hearing will get that hopefully today. So
Thank you.
there's that information, and we'll be sending out the AIS for your deliberations on that, hopefully Wednesday or Thursday.
Thank you.
Yes, we'll do our best to get that as soon as possible. I know. Yeah. You have, but you need your time. There's a lot of material to review there. I think that's it for
Well,
us.
Amy sent out a message at 11:38 saying it's in the Dropbox.
Oh, good. Okay, it's done.
Okay. Other items from the commission?
Do we want, well, and I don't know if it's appropriate, but I mean, should we give kind of a little bit of a review to some of the people that weren't at, as far as, I mean, there were some procedural, we came up against a few procedural things at the public hearing that,
I'm in the midst of reviewing the hearing online. I think I'll get it as if I were there.
okay.
Commissioner
I mean, we had
Jaworski
to
has
take votes.
watched.
I saw
Yeah.
it.
I almost watched it twice.
Sorry I missed it.
And there are things that, I mean, post meeting, the commissioners that were there and staff kind of discussed some of the things, maybe we should have a better procedure put out, so that all parties are aware, so that we don't encounter these types of things at further ones.
And I think we can put in place some maybe better communication, clearer communication as far as what the procedure is, just to make sure that everyone understands what we normally do, but just to make sure that that's clear.
Yeah. And that's kind of what I was talking about. I mean, we had a little caucus afterwards.
I see.
We're saying,
Thank you.
This didn't really go as smoothly as we would have wanted. Staff, maybe we should look at some other ways of making it clearer and those types of things. I wasn't really saying, I wanted to see what happened there, but there was, after the meeting adjourned, there was a ad hoc kind of discussion as to how we can make this thing better.
John?
My apologies. Thank you for clarifying. I do think perhaps the reason that the issue arose is out of an attempt to try to give both the applicant and the appellant equal time, which we haven't always done in the past. So at least it didn't seem that way to me. So I'm honoring what you did to get to where you got to, and yeah, maybe a little more fine-tuning would make it even better.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, since it was brought up when I watched the tape and I made notes, I just sort of said the same thing, that maybe it should be clearer when time is allocated for applicant appellant, that it's stated that the appellant is those identified within that time frame, and that the other public people have their 3-minute slots. One would think one would know that from the few meetings that I've been to, and most of them are repeats to people that show up that are either applicants or appellants for the most part. But, yeah, I can totally agree that it could have been a little, if it's a little clear, then there's no opportunity for that type of potential misinformation and conflict.
And I had thought that was clear, but I'm certainly willing to reiterate that again when we get in those situations, just to make sure that everyone there hopefully completely understands the procedure. So we're happy to do that.
And without hopefully messing up the deliberation, it seems as if the appellant wanted to have an introduction and a conclusion and have everybody else in the middle, and I think that's where the confusion came.
I think that's where the confusion came. Yeah. Yeah, and we should probably be careful that we don't start deliberating.
Nope. I just wanted the discussion that took place after.
Procedural. Yeah. I think we can fine tune the procedure.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, hearing nothing else, meeting adjourned.